Hi everyone, welcome. During our most recent check-in with a couple of my European nightcrawler bins, the bins that I was referring to as the overly damp systems, I brought this fan to everyone's attention as my next line of defense against dealing with the excess moisture in the systems. And the fan has been blowing on those systems over the course of a few days. I did also come in over the past 10 days, which was the last time we checked in and fed those systems, to actually aerate the contents of the bins. And the bins are already out here on the bench, all set for their feeding. So why don't I slip on a glove and we're going to get to work on checking in how moisture and everything else is holding up in these systems. So now, over the past 10 days since we last checked in, I've had to come in here and use the bench for feeding other systems. So these systems have not been sitting out here in front of the fan exclusively for the past 10 days. They did probably get a good 3 or 4 days out in front of the fan. And then besides that, I also came in here numerous times to aerate the system. So on 4 separate occasions over the past 10 days, I came in here to stir the contents and to bring the more moist stuff that's down below up to the surface, and take the more dry stuff out here on the surface and sink it down low. So my hope is that by now things are hopefully a little bit more under control. But really quick, before we get started, let's just talk about the specifics. The older system is here on this side. That's the 255-day-old system, and the younger one is here, 231 days of age, fed at this point 25 times here and 20 times over here. Now, there was one area of concern, I must admit, which was the way I put worm chow. I got my worm chow, one of the things that I add to my feedings pretty regularly, but a weird thing I did with this stuff last time was that I started spreading it all over the place into numerous places throughout the bin, and it made me wonder if I could have possibly created an environment here that was a little bit uncomfortable for the worms, because I did actually notice a number of worms outside of the bin, dead on the floor, unfortunately, worm jerky. And another thing, not sure if it's visible on the camera, but there is evidence on the sides of these bins all over the place of worm traffic up the sides of the containers. So I've not seen any of that, worms exiting the bin activity lately over the past few days, but in the very beginning after the last check-in, I did definitely notice signs of worms exiting the bin and ending up in a pretty bad place where they pretty much perished out in the dry outside of the safety of the nice comfortable worm bin. And I don't think it was because things were drying or becoming the other extreme where things had been too damp and then they became too dry. Definitely not that. I think it might have had something to do with the worm chow, because I did pile worm chow in here all over the place, not just down where we normally feed, but I put some in there, I put some in here, I put some over there, I sprinkled it all over the top. There was worm chow everywhere, and it made me worry that maybe, I don't know, maybe things got a little bit out of control in here, maybe heated up a little bit, maybe the environment became uncomfortable for some of the worms, they couldn't take it no more, so they bailed out. I mean, I'm glad to see that that activity has subsided now, but it did make me worry over those few days in the beginning after the last feeding, when I saw worms on a daily basis ending up outside the worm bin, and I would sweep up the worm jerky from around the bins and then come back the next day and find more. But luckily I haven't seen that over the past few days. So down here in the middle was where we would have last fed, but like I said, I've been in here numerous times to aerate and to stir the contents of these bins around. So if there's any leftovers, we're not going to see them, that's for sure, because I've been blending everything together, stirring it all around. But you know what? If I had to provide just like an initial impression of how things in these systems are, they seem really nice. Everything seems to be crumbling now. Nothing seems to be holding together like a big wad of nasty mud, at least over in the older bin. I'm really pleased to see that. And it is because we, did numerous things to really do our best to try to get things under control in here again. The fan, the aeration, Even the use of a whole bunch of completely dry bedding placed in here a couple feedings ago to try to suck up some of the moisture that was present in the systems. So as good as things are looking over here in this bin, I'd like to also make sure that that's the same story over in the younger bin. But things have looked pretty consistent in terms of the improvement we've been observing over the past few weeks and more recently over the past couple days. So my guess is that in here things are going to look very similar. Yeah, a lot of this freshly added dry bedding is still going to be showing up throughout the system. I put a lot of it in here in the hopes that it would suck up some of the excess moisture. I've not even talked about that object that I unearthed earlier. It's the compostable bag. This is the system that has the compostable bag in it. And I think last time we checked in 10 days ago, I think the bag was up to 131 days of age now, so maybe we're up to 141. I took some notes, but I didn't make note of that for whatever reason. And while things were very damp and I kept coming in here over and over to aerate and everything else, I did always find worms hanging out on that thing. So whether or not they're actually nibbling on it or not, it's hard to tell. I'm not in a rush to pull it out just because we're not seeing immediate results. But if at some point, an inordinate amount of time passes and we see no results, then I'll probably just pull it out. A lot of people have been kind of forecasting that that's what's going to happen anyway. It's like, why bother? Everyone else that does that always ends up with the same end game, which is waiting for some activity, and then eventually just giving up and removing it from the worm bins. But whatever, we're not in that much of a rush. We can just let the compostable bag ride, and maybe we'll see some progress. I believe here too, things are actually looking really nice. Things are crumbly and loose, and nothing gives me that feeling like we're still dealing with excess moisture in here any longer. Boy, am I pleased to see that. In fact, I'm almost reluctant to leave these systems uncovered to permit even further drying, because I don't think any further drying is even really needed. In fact, I even had my collection here of the entirely dry bedding material, freshly shredded paper cardboard combination. I thought maybe we'd come in with some more of that, but I wouldn't want to send things into the opposite direction and create an environment that's overly dry either. But you know what? Since the stuff that I bought down for them includes a couple of new coffee filters, these new coffee filters will become their replacement feeding zone indicators. So perhaps one thing we can do is to put the old feeding zone indicators that had been in here previously down under the feedings as sort of the foundation for the foods that they're going to be getting. And then I think we can start coming in with the stuff that I had allocated for today's feeding. This came out of the freezer a little while ago. It's beginning to thaw, and there's even a little bit of moisture collecting down here. So let's see about divvying this up evenly. This part of the food supply is potato, so I'll take half of it and move it over to the other bin. And then this is lettuce, it seems. As the stuff thaws out, it becomes really gooey, and I think the worms are going to appreciate that. It's not all that much of a feeding, but there's the coffee as well. And then I do have my worm chow too. So I think it'll be a pretty decent feeding, not bringing with it a whole lot of moisture. At best, the lettuce might bring with it a little bit of moisture, but the potato is a pretty dry type of a food. The worm chow that they're going to be getting is a pretty dry type of a food too. The fan continues to blow down here onto the onto the bench, and it's sending some of the stuff that's in my pulverized eggshell, sending a little bit of it flying, because it's not just eggshell, it's some of that inner membrane, I think, that is inside of an egg. And when I dry my eggshells and then pulverize them, all that membrane also kind of ends up in my collection of grit. So I do try to separate that also. but it doesn't always end up becoming a nice clean batch. Sometimes some of that stuff remains, and usually I don't see it either because I don't have a fan blowing onto my bench like I do today. But that is kind of revealing to show how much of the stuff is not even really eggshell, it's just that egg membrane. No. Yeah. Alright. So, when it comes to the worm chow now, I'm focusing it only into the feeding area. And I think another thing people have mentioned was don't submerge the worm chow either. Leave it only out on the surface. I don't know. For whatever reason, I have this tendency not to take heed to people's suggestions all the time. Sometimes I do, but not all the time. Oh, but before we backfill this particular bin's feeding zone, we need to return the compostable bag back down into the feeding area. I guess, you know, another thing that I thought might help this thing continue getting broken down was maybe to just increase the interest in it by throwing some of the worm chow right on top of the bag too. And let's just throw another little tiny bit in here to make it an even amount into each system. This way, who knows, maybe we'll increase the traffic onto the compostable bag and further help its breakdown, if it's even breaking down. It's hard to tell. I mean, just to look at it, you could tell there's definitely holes developing in it and on it. But whether that's due to worms or me just being too rough with it and it tearing or something, I really couldn't tell you for sure. I'm not terribly careful with the thing. Sometimes I am a little bit rough with it. So before we close up, I'm just very curious to see how moisture is throughout the entire bin. So before we actually call it a day here, I'm going to also inspect the outer edges of both of the bins just to make sure that things are just as nice out there too, and they are. Everything seems loose and crumbly, not going to the other extreme of becoming too dry. Luckily, everything's got a nice moisture content to it. I could feel it as I touch it and handle it. And I think one of the best telltales of how good or bad the moisture content of the bin is just the presence of the worms. I mean, if there were if there was no worms hanging out in this stuff, then that would tell me that maybe I'd allowed it to become a little bit overly dry. But there's worms everywhere in this system, throughout the material, in all reaches of it. And I'm really hoping that the worms are now just content to stay in the bed and not have this urge to exit the bin and wander out. Sometimes when I'm kind of rough doing the tilling up of the material in the systems, I notice some worm traffic. And I think maybe for that reason, just when we settle down here and we finish, I'm going to give these systems a chance just to sit out here under the fan for a little while, in the hopes that maybe the breeze blowing across the bin will create a somewhat drier atmosphere that the worms just don't want to venture out into. So I think just by leaving the fan on the systems for a little while until the worms chill out and are no longer bothered by all the disruption that I've created here, and then they just stay down in the bedding. It'll be after that all happens I'll feel that I could just put these systems back where they were and then not worry about worms trying to exit the systems again. So before we're done here, why don't we quickly till up the far edge of this slightly older bin over here. Here we can see that there's just a higher concentration of castings, it seems, a little bit more so than in the other bin. Not as much left over of the dry bedding that had been placed into both systems to help with drying and absorbing moisture, which is kind of interesting because I did put in a pretty good amount into both systems, and I did expect to see a good bit more in here, but maybe in here we've got a slightly greater number of worms working the material down. I wouldn't think so, because these are both bins that were launched on the same day and handled the same way, and presumably launched with a fairly equal number of worms, or at least a close number of worms. I didn't jot down the estimated worm population numbers for these systems, but you know, after all those hundreds of days that these systems have been in service now, those numbers sort of become a little bit irrelevant and obsolete and outdated, just based on the assumption that the worms are probably breeding and increasing that number considerably from what it was thought to be when we first launched the system. Yeah, man, I tell you. In this older bin, there's just so little left over of the dry, well, certainly not dry anymore, but the paper and cardboard shreds that had been placed in here to help things dry off. So maybe in this system we might have a somewhat more hungry population working that stuff down a little bit more quickly than in the other bin. But I really don't have an explanation as to why we're seeing that slight difference. It just seems to be something that I'm observing here, but I could be completely wrong. Might just be a figment of my imagination. All right, everyone, that's it for our check-in now with our 255 and 231 day European nightcrawler systems finally back from being overly damp and now perfect as far as I'm concerned, or very close to perfect. Very nice, as far as I like to say. Hopefully you agree. But that's the end of the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.